In the last episode, we looked at how Mr. Darcy became a prisoner of his own isolation and pride. But if you thought he was the only complicated character in this story, you were very wrong. Today we're talking about Elizabeth Bennet. She is widely regarded as the gold standard of wit and perceptiveness. But what if I told you that her intelligence became a trap? Elizabeth is a perfect example of how confidence in your ability to read people can become the very thing that blinds you. While Darcy was battling his ego, Lizzy was battling phantoms she had built herself. Today we're going to look at how confirmation bias works, why a sharp mind makes us more susceptible to manipulators like Wickham, and how our own mental filters lead us to excuse some people of everything while holding others to an impossible standard. Welcome to part 2 of our psychology breakdown of Pride and Prejudice. If Mr. Darcy is a paranoid type, Elizabeth Bennet is a classic emotive. Emotives are people with high emotional sensitivity and a deep need for genuine human connection. They read the moods of those around them with remarkable precision and feel things intensely. But this same sensitivity is their vulnerability. A powerful first impression literally stamps itself into their perception and becomes extremely difficult to revise. Where the paranoid type builds a wall out of principles, the emotive builds a wall out of wounded feeling and defends it with no less determination. Elizabeth is vivid, ironic, and unlike Darcy, she genuinely needs authentic human contact. And yet there is one key feature that marks a deep similarity in their worldviews: a powerful internal frame of reference. Lizzy, like Darcy, is in the habit of relying exclusively on her own judgments. She decides who is guilty and delivers her verdict herself. But it is important to understand that her bias did not appear out of nowhere. At their very first meeting at the ball, Darcy committed a fatal error. He did not merely behave coldly, he said out loud that Lizzy was not attractive enough to dance with. Elizabeth heard it. Her pride was wounded. As she later admitted herself, she could easily have forgiven his arrogance if he had not hurt her personally. That was the critical moment. Her internal frame of reference received what felt like cast-iron proof of his insufferable character, grounded in direct personal experience. That incident became the foundation for confirmation bias. Her mind shifted instantly into cognitive economy mode. Having encountered his contempt once, she filed Darcy under arrogant snob. From that point on, any negative information about him was not evaluated for accuracy. It simply settled onto already prepared ground. She began collecting his failures as evidence, each one a fresh confirmation of her own perceptiveness. And the irony is this: the sharper the mind, the more sophisticated its ability to justify its own errors, turning bias into unshakable truth. This is where Wickham enters, the story's primary antagonist and Darcy's exact opposite when it comes to first impressions. But his success with Elizabeth cannot be explained by personal charm alone. What kicks in at full force here is the halo effect. Wickham is handsome, socially fluent, and possesses the manners of a perfect gentleman. Our brains are lazy. If we like someone's appearance and find them pleasant company, we automatically assign them other positive qualities: honesty, nobility, integrity. For Elizabeth, whose mind was already actively searching for evidence of Darcy's villainy, Wickham, with his ready-made hero's halo, was the ideal source. The real artistry of his manipulation lay in how skillfully he wove lies together with truth. Wickham understood that to be believed, you need to anchor your story in verifiable facts. He drew on widely known details about old Mr. Darcy's will and various legal arrangements, but gave them his own distorted interpretation. He did not overdramatize, and he did not cast himself as a saintly martyr. He released information in careful doses with an air of dignified sorrow. This disarmed Elizabeth's critical instinct entirely. The account seemed too specific and too plausible to be invention. This is precisely why reading Darcy's letter at Rosings was such a profound shock. It was not a romantic gesture. The contents of the letter hit her like a blow. Lizzy read it over and over, painfully cross-referencing Wickham's version against Darcy's arguments. She went back through her memories. Who had said what, how they had behaved, what details had surfaced in passing conversations. Through those inconsistencies, she asked herself for the first time, is Wickham actually a good person? What she realized was disturbing. Wickham was masterful at creating an impression, but over the entire course of their acquaintance, he had not performed a single action that confirmed it. On the contrary, his pursuit of Miss King the moment she came into money only deepened the new suspicion. He simply needed funds. Later, when Elizabeth meets Darcy's sister Georgiana, her mistake becomes undeniable. Instead of the haughty young woman described in the rumors, she finds a socially awkward, genuinely shy girl. Elizabeth had to work through this enormous volume of information entirely on her own, reconstructing reality piece by piece from the wreckage of her own prejudices. At this point, she deliberately chose not to go to Colonel Fitzwilliam to verify the story. And it was not laziness. She understood that Fitzwilliam was an interested party, Darcy's cousin and close friend, and therefore could not be a neutral judge. Lizzy chose the path of independent analysis. It was a painful dismantling of her confidence in her own infallibility. She understood that she had been judging people on wounded pride and attractive packaging, not on facts. To fully understand how Elizabeth's bias operates, we need to look at her reaction to Mr. Collins. Collins is Darcy's absolute opposite, an anxious type driven entirely by external reference. He does not take a single step without checking it against the opinion of his patroness, Lady Catherine. For Lizzy, he is a walking absurdity, an inexhaustible source of material for her wit. And here we witness a striking psychological phenomenon, double standards in action. When her closest friend Charlotte Lucas accepts Collins's proposal, Lizzy is genuinely outraged. She judges Charlotte entirely by her own internal standards. How can anyone marry without love or respect? To Elizabeth, this is a betrayal of principle. She is so blinded by her own sense of how the world ought to work that she refuses to engage with Charlotte's actual reality, for whom this marriage is the only available route out of dependency and into some form of security. But look at what happens when Wickham finds himself in an analogous situation. The moment it becomes known that he has abandoned Lizzy and begun pursuing Miss King for her £10,000, Elizabeth demonstrates a remarkable flexibility. She defends him. She says that handsome young men also have to eat. This is a textbook case of in-group favoritism. Those we like or mistakenly feel are on our side. We excuse for everything, constructing perfectly logical justifications. While those we dislike or find irritating, we hold to the strictest possible standard, with no mitigating circumstances allowed. Elizabeth defends Wickham, because to admit his mercenary motives would be to admit that her celebrated intuition had failed her again. She is prepared to damage her friendship with Charlotte by criticizing her choice, but she clings to the illusion of Wickham's nobility until the very end, because that illusion is feeding her ego. To understand why Elizabeth trusts her own judgments so absolutely, we need to look at the system she grew up inside. The Bennet household is a constant source of social tension, and Lizzy long ago became its sharpest and most clear-eyed observer. Her perceptiveness has been honed to a fine edge, because it is the only reliable tool for navigating a space where everyone around her is, in some way, behaving badly. Consider how quickly she saw through the Bingley sisters. While society admired their polished manner, Lizzy immediately identified their hypocrisy. She could see that their warmth toward Jane was a thin veneer concealing their contempt for the family's social standing. For Caroline Bingley and her sister, a match between their brother and Jane was an unacceptable misalliance. They had no intention of becoming connected to people whose manners and position they found beneath them. Elizabeth saw clearly the gap between what they said and what they did, and every time she was proved right, her faith in her own ability to read people was reinforced. At home, meanwhile, she was surrounded by figures who offered further exercise for that critical eye. Lydia and Kitty are, in a sense, dark reflections of the two elder sisters. If Kitty is entirely dependent on Lydia, Lydia herself is all tactlessness and vulgar officer hunting, everything that the restrained and considerate Jane is not. And then there is their mother, whose anxiety about her daughter's futures expresses itself in behavior that is socially mortifying. This is often read as simple stupidity, but psychologically, it is a classic example of an anxious type operating under survival conditions. Her obsessive determination to get her daughters married is not vanity or foolishness. It is the only strategy available to her for keeping her family from poverty. But for all her sharpness, Lizzy was a prisoner of her own isolation. She simply had no one to think things through with as an equal. Her closest person, Jane, was too gentle and too charitable. She refused to see the worst in anyone and was always ready to find a reason to excuse any behavior. The result was that Lizzy grew accustomed to treating her own perspective as the only accurate one, since Jane was too soft-hearted to notice the ugliness in people. And everyone else in the family was too absorbed in themselves. The final blow came through her father. Mr. Bennet was the only person whose intelligence she respected without reservation. But as the story unfolds, she is forced to see the uncomfortable truth. His sarcasm is simply a mechanism for avoiding responsibility. When it becomes clear, after the conversation about Lydia's trip to Brighton, that he simply does not care enough to prevent it and is prepared to risk the family's reputation for the sake of his own peace, Lizzy understands with finality. On the questions that actually matter, she is entirely on her own. Pride and Prejudice is not simply a classic love story. It is the story of how two strong intellects found the courage to admit that their picture of the world was broken. Darcy had to dismantle his information bubble. His journey is a lesson for everyone who believes that status, wealth, or the right background gives them a monopoly on truth. To see the real Elizabeth, he had to acknowledge that his standards were not universal laws. They were his own personal limits. In the modern world, we are all a little bit Darcy. Social media algorithms feed us only what we already agree with, creating the illusion that the whole world thinks as we do. Getting out of that bubble is always painful, but it is the only road back to reality. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had to face her confirmation bias. Her story is a mirror for our own time, where we label someone on the basis of a single phrase or a look we didn't like, and then filter out any evidence that contradicts the verdict. We believe charming manipulators like Wickham because they tell us what resonates with our existing pain, and we judge pragmatists like Charlotte because their honesty strikes us as too unsentimental. The central lesson of both parts is simple. Our brains are lazy instruments that are constantly trying to hand us easy answers instead of difficult truths. Darcy and Elizabeth did not find happiness because they were perfect for each other. They found it because they were capable of genuine self-reflection. They managed to press pause and ask themselves, what if I'm wrong? In a world where everyone is determined to be right at any cost, the most useful thing you can do is sometimes find the courage to admit your own bias. Because real perceptiveness begins not with the ability to see through other people, but with the ability to notice the blind spots in yourself. And if your critical mind is telling you that this breakdown was worth your time, don't suppress that perfectly reasonable instinct. Like and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, who do you think was more blind in this story, Darcy with his class-bound arrogance, or Lizzy with her faith in her own infallible judgment? Or do you think Charlotte Lucas was the only truly rational person in the whole affair? See you in the next one.